Welcome to the Forever in Their Hearts podcast with Dale Martin Jr., brought to you by Martin Brothers, providing funerals designed and customized to be as special as your loved one lost. Now, here's your host.
Well, yes, this is your host, Erik Reynolds, and I'm back again today with Valerie Martell, Director of Operations for Martin Brothers Funeral Services. And today, Valerie will talk about interesting funeral services from around the world. Now, right before Valerie joins us, just as a reminder that if you have questions or require assistance, you can reach Martin Brothers Funeral Services in Vancouver at 778-330-7799. Again, that's 778-330-7799. Well, Valerie, hello, welcome to the call, and it's great to be talking with you again today.
Hi, Erik. Nice to talk to you, too.
Now, Valerie, I'm really kind of excited about this topic. It's very interesting, and I'm sure, when it comes to funerals, there are so many traditions for different cultures, and I'm interested to hear about some of the requests maybe you've received over the years. So let me ask this first question, which is, what are some of the most interesting funeral traditions that you are aware of?
Oh, Erik, around the world there are just so many, but I'll talk about a couple that really stand out to me for a couple of reasons. One of them is in South Korea, and, in countries like that, since there isn't a lot of room, we in Canada have a little bit of a different story. We have a ton of room, but in South Korea, since there isn't a lot of room to inter people in the ground, there's, of course, a law stating, and many countries have this, that people can't stay in their graves. So, after a number of years, they're disinterred. They're cremated at that point, and the remains are then returned to their families. And, the culture has really responded to this, and what they've done is instead of burying people at the very beginning, what they do now a lot of times is they'll cremate their loved one and have the cremated remains made into beads, which are strung, and then they're displayed in the home. So they don't even go the route of interring people anymore sometimes. So that's just one of the ones that kind of stands out as interesting to me. In our culture, we'd be, how do you explain these beads to people who come in the home? But, it is one of their traditions, which is really interesting. Another that stands out to me that is quite interesting, and this is simply because in some places in the world, funeral rites and ceremonies last a long time. They go on for days or months sometimes. So, the way we're used to it is that the funeral takes place, in the span of a day or a couple of days sort of thing. But, for instance, in Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church, the bells ring out once to just normally call worshipers to come to the service just on any given Sunday or whatever. But when a child is born, they ring out in a low to high sequence, so low notes to high notes for baptisms. And for funerals, they ring out in a high to low sequence. So, it kind of denotes that beginning of life, that end of life. And funerals are generally held on the third day after someone dies. On that day, the family and friends gather together. They have a special memorial dinner. And then on the 9th day, when they believe the soul leaves the body, there's also another special church service, and another dinner is held. On the 40th day, that's when they believe that the soul departs for another world, and they have another service and another dinner party. I think this appeals to me because I like dinner parties. But so they have this other dinner party, and at each party, a glass of vodka is poured, and a piece of black bread is left for the deceased. So, that's a real reversal of the, in the Russian custom, breaking bread with someone when you meet them is the tradition. So, they do it the opposite way. They leave the vodka and they leave the bread for the deceased, when they die. And then traditionally in that culture, the body lays uncovered in state for 3 days until burial. So, interesting stuff that happens in that one. It carries on for a long time. Throughout the world, there are as many different traditions, around the globe as there are people. However, what remains constant is that people mark the occasion of death, and we do it for a reason. And that reason is because there's a shift in our reality. The world no longer contains that person with whom we had a relationship. And we have to create a new reality, and that reality is based on memories. So from time to time, I deal with families that say, Dad didn't want a funeral, but we're having trouble imagining this is just done. Like, we walk into your office and then we walk out and it's done. What's happening there is that they're feeling a loss, but they have a natural desire for some type of closure, some type of commemoration of their dad's life. And what we can do is work together and we can create something to mark that occasion. It continues to be done around the world in many, many different ways. And, we can do that here as well.
Really interesting there with the different traditions that we've seen. And even myself, I've seen some different traditions as I've traveled around the world. But let me ask you this question. What about caskets and urns and, all the other things that go with the funeral? Now, are they the same everywhere, or do some places have different funeral products than others do?
Well, basically the intent of the products is the same. The casket is meant to contain the deceased. The intent of the urn is to contain the remains of the deceased. However, greater than that basic purpose, the idea is that the casket or the urn reflects who the person was. For instance, I have worked with many families who come into the arrangement office. They come into the process not knowing what they want as far as funeral products. They don't realize there are so many options available. And, I'll show them products that make sense to their particular situation, keeping in mind all kinds of things, budget, the overall look of what they're seeking. Families will say to me, Dad wasn't a shiny wood kind of guy. And when they identify this, I can begin by showing them some caskets, showing them some things with a matte finish, different finishes that are not the shiny wood finish. Beyond all of that, to fully answer your question, yes, there are different products available in different places throughout the world. One of the ones that really stands out to me, and anybody can Google this online, the Ga tribe in Ghana. Funerals there are such important celebrations. They're a time to celebrate the person's whole life. And oftentimes the entire community comes together to pay for these elaborate coffins that they truly reflect what a person's life on earth was all about. And they're themed after a different hobby or a dream achievement of this person. So in that culture, you see these coffins, and they're an elaborate replica of things like an airplane, a shoe, a fish, a car, or really whatever else they can dream up, whatever is really specific to that family. They're quite interesting. People can go online and they can search these out, and you wouldn't even know that they're a casket or a coffin is what they call them there. They wouldn't even know it. They're just unbelievable. And some of them, being where we're from, I think, wow, how do they dig the grave to accommodate that? But, it's quite interesting, and they're colorful, and they're, exact replicas of these items. So that's just one of the places that has really something stand out as far as
Wow.
funeral products go.
Wow. Well, I just thinking about this as you were talking, Martin Brothers has been around for, 100 years, 4 generations, I believe it is.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that I'm sure you haven't been there for 100 years, but for as long as you've been there, you've probably seen something that's just been your favorite, either with Martin Brothers or around the world. Do you mind maybe sharing what that might be?
Oh, sure, absolutely, Eric. My personal favorite is actually closer to home than you would think. I know about funeral traditions from around the world, but my number one favorite funeral tradition is the New Orleans funeral tradition. These funerals were once described by outsiders as jazz funerals, a little bit of a misnomer. They're really funerals filled with music. And what they are is they're based upon both the European and the African tradition. There's a strong emphasis on the funeral procession. The reason I like this is because I believe that the procession is one of the most important parts of the funeral, both practically and symbolically. What we're doing with the procession is we're taking our loved one from a place of the living to the place of the dead. It's that completion, it's that separation, it's that real significance of moving someone from being amongst us to a place where they are no longer amongst us. So in New Orleans, people do the procession like none other. From the home to the church, the family processes with the casket to the sound of somber dirges and hymns, and it's just the family and, of course, the funeral people and the casket. They go to the church, they have the service. Following the service, these change to marches, swinging sounds, dancing. Everyone else follows in. It's called the second line, and that's the friends and other mourners that join in the procession. They oftentimes are carrying the casket at this point towards the cemetery. These marches are ringing out. People have parasols because, of course, New Orleans is extremely hot in the summertime. So they've got their parasols overhead, and they're swinging those, and often they're swinging the casket. I really urge people to actually check out this funeral tradition on places like YouTube. There are some on there that are just amazing. The music is amazing. The people are amazing. One of my standout favorites for sure.
Wow. And, we've talked about so many interesting traditions from around the world, South Korea, Ghana, of course, New Orleans, locally here. The question I have is, some of these different funeral traditions, being so interesting, would it be possible if I took some of the ideas and incorporate them into a Vancouver funeral?
Absolutely. For instance, I know of a local Vancouver band that plays New Orleans-style funeral music. They actually played for us at the convention this year in Vancouver, which was really interesting. There are many other elements that you can choose to incorporate into a service that come from elsewhere. In reality, in this country, we are a people with roots in other cultures. So whether we realize it or not, we are bringing all of those influences in already. When we're marking the end of a person's life, it's so important to acknowledge where that person comes from, and really that may include a nuance of traditions from other parts of the world. So, to answer that question, absolutely. You can come to me and we can start planning and deciding and, incorporating what's really important to you.
Well, Valerie, it's been such an amazing and really interesting conversation. Now, before we go, do you have any maybe final thoughts that you'd like to share on the topic?
I do, Eric. And that is that there are established funeral traditions based upon all sorts of things. They're based upon ethnicity, they're based upon religion, or they're simply based upon family practice. However, that being said, sometimes those traditions have become lost or they were never really established in the first place, which is fine. There's an opportunity all the time to establish new traditions with the loss of a loved one. And when we base the service on something meaningful and something memorable, we're establishing our own funeral traditions. Also, when we're meeting to discuss the funeral arrangements, don't hesitate to let me know. Let us know what you're thinking about, and we can really help you create the service that's most meaningful and most appropriate. You don't have to come to us with something fully established or something fully thought out in mind. What we do is we sit down with you and we go through all sorts of talking and getting to know one another so that we can really create something that is meaningful, that may reflect something from somewhere else, but something that is important to you as a family.
Well, Valerie, thank you so much for the stories of the uniqueness and different ways that funerals are and memorials are done around the world. In the next episode, we're going to talk more about some unique requests that you've had for funeral services. Now, for our listeners, if you can think of someone who might benefit or just might find real interest in what we've talked about and covered here today, forward this episode to them. I promise you they'll thank you for it. And of course, if you have questions or require assistance, you need to reach out to Martin Brothers Funeral Services here in Vancouver at 778-330-7799. Again, that's 778-330-7799. Or visit their wonderful website at www.mbfunerals.com. Again, that's www.mbfunerals.com. Well, once again, Valerie, for myself, for the listeners, thanks so much for the conversation.
Thanks, Eric.
You've been listening to the Forever in Their Hearts podcast with Dale Martin Jr. from Martin Brothers Funeral Services. Our 4 generations of service in the funeral profession have equipped us with a legacy of understanding. In your hour of need, Martin Brothers is there. Call Martin Brothers in Vancouver today at 778-330-7799 and visit them online at www.mbfunerals.com.